I'm joined today with Irene Liu, who's Managing Director of Strategy and Consulting in Accenture, or as I prefer to title you, as the Queen of Data Governance. Irene, welcome. Data, AI, and everything. An unscripted environment for us to really have the chats on the stuff that actually please get me extremely interested and hopefully others. I was actually just thinking, we first met, it's a few years already now, and you were part in PwC, same aspect, compliance, regulatory aspect, and I was with Monetary Authority of Singapore.
Exactly, yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, I actually think it was that event that I went on stage to a room full of compliance officers.
Yes, exactly.
And that kind of brings me back to, I say it in jest, but I actually truly mean it when I say the queen of regulatory affairs. When we think about this kind of world, and it's something that I've learned to become very passionate about, and I had to. I was working for a regulator.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about when we first met, and I had that vision and what we were trying to drive in terms of how do we transform that world of reporting, regulatory reporting. Because every time I would open up the hood, it was always kind of shrouded with mystery. And every time someone would say the word compliance, you see the color running out of people's faces and people trying to run out of the room.
Self-fear.
Yeah, what is it? What is this world that everyone's trying to uncover and sort it out and all of these things and people get into trouble? What is it? What is it for you?
Compliance is a little bit easier for me, maybe, because I'm born and bred in a world whereby I started with an accountant, right? So therefore, controls, governance is part of ingrained in my culture. Secondly, is also I grew up in a home of a tiger mom. So again, obedience is something that is also very close to my heart and my culture as well. So when I'm talking about compliance in our banking industry per se, I feel that it is about the ability to self-regulate, especially you're not doing or not behaving just because a regulator is looking at you. You're behaving well because this is your social responsibility towards the wider market, the layman on the street who has put their trust in you to be able to cure their money well and to be able to protect their money and to make sure that it's vested properly to their best interests. I find so that is what I call by compliance in a nutshell.
Is it because look, at the end of the day, that boils down, and I guess swinging back also to the title of this conversation of data, AI, and all that kind of stuff. In the end of the day, that is driven by the ability to understand what's happening.
Yeah,
and I used to joke, and I don't think people used to appreciate sometimes I don't think many people sometimes appreciate my jokes, but I used to say that actually even I would argue that the reason why financial institutions, obviously today, there are many reasons for it, we're in the AI kind of revolution and so forth, but I used to say that the reason why financial institutions are even collecting data, or even have a starting point or the view with respect to data, is because regulators, is because of that compliance perspective of you need to do this essentially. Why does it seem like it's so difficult? Or is it really difficult? Or we just kind of, on the outside, we just kind of get the bad news and the bad press. Actually, it is working.
Okay, to me, data is a means of communication between the banks and the regulators because the banks are doing their business on a day-to-day basis, minute by minute, right? Transactions are happening. Now, how do they give the regulators the assurance that things are happening as per intended to ensure that there is soundness in the system, to ensure that the risks are well managed? So therefore, data is a means of communicating that back to regulators because you can make a lot of empty promises, you can talk to regulators and so on and so forth, but give me the data points. And therefore, it is the data that itself that enforces the trust in it to the regulators to say, look, by the data that you give to me, does it comply with what you have articulated to me? Now, obviously, there will be some banks which are taking more higher risk appetite and therefore taking more risk and so on and so forth. But that's it. Does it reconcile with your intention? Does it reconcile with, again, what is the intended purpose of your organization and the objective as well?
So it's actually interesting. So when you're saying that, I don't know why, and it's actually the first time I've even had this kind of thought bubble. I thought about medical examination. When you go to the doctor and you can say, oh, I'm feeling great. Yeah, but you better stop eating that salty food and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's really that. It's, again, in lack of a better description, it's a health checkup. And that's essentially what having the capacity and ability of providing a true reflection of an organization performance. And that actually becomes really important because then I would then, and please, like I said, you're the one who's really been doing this stuff, is I would actually then go down the path of arguing that while maybe it was requested by regulators and bodies and whatnot, and obviously you'll get fined if you don't do it, but actually they're now secondary. Because if it is that view, it is that health check, it is the quality, it is the understanding of how we're managing the risk appetite that an organization has. And that's actually interesting because I want to almost maybe at some point veer out from the world of finance. Actually, it's not for the regulator, it's for me.
Exactly. And my personal opinion of data has always been, David, look, you don't need the health inspector to come and tell you, please keep your house clean. You need to keep the house clean, hygienic for your own purposes, for your own health purposes. And that's what I advocate for data governance within the bank as well. Why do you need the regulators to come and tell you you need to do A, B, C? You need to make sure that you have good data controls, you need to make sure that you have the data stakeholders, and so forth defined, right? And you need to be able to define CDEs and so on, coming all to these different terms, right? However, do you really need the regulators to tell you that? No, you don't need to.
But I would argue that, like I was talking to someone the other day, and we're talking about, say, you should not commit crimes. It's break the law. You don't need someone to come and tell you not to break the law. But then we do need the police force. We need to have reminders. And yet today, we still need to have a regulator to come and still remind, sometimes gently, sometimes a bit more forcefully, that this is necessary. So, and maybe to plug something in, because this is happening, and it's the reality within the financial sector, which one could argue is one of the most regulated spaces among most industries.
Agree.
So if we think, and again, it'll have a small risk veering out to that kind of the worlds of AI or the other stuff, or even just, even forget AI, still data. How is this going to work in spaces and industries that are not regulated at all? So based on your point that you don't need someone to come and tell you to do the right thing. Someone shouldn't tell you that, okay, fine, you're not going to go to the gym every day, but crying out loud, you need to go at least once a week or once a month, if necessary, making sure if you have certain statements about risk, this is something that's good for you. But in the world that is regulated, you find that you still need the
regulator.
Tiger Mom, maybe, if I use your analogy, to kick in. And again, we can have a discussion and debate about that and how to make efficiency, but I'm just wondering, is that if that is the case in the regulated space, is it what's almost like reality that's going to unfold in the unregulated space when you're hearing a lot of folks who are saying, no, don't worry about us. We can self-regulate. I'm scratching my head. I'm like, will it?
Okay, so when we're talking to industry, so I'm talking to, for example, the shipping industry as well, in terms of the need for data governance and so on, a lot of the need for so-called data and the regulations, right? Or not say regulations, I would say the data governance itself is primarily driven by the fact that they want to do better. They want to be competitive. And they want to be able to use data, not just for defensive purpose, i.e. for controls purposes, but also to be on the offensive side, which means to say that they want to be able to use data to drive innovation. They want to drive further insight into organization and to be able to know how to better manage the organization as well. So this has been the primary driving force.
Okay, that's fascinating statement. And if I slightly allow me to rephrase it, and the way I'm thinking about it is, if you look at it traditionally, and my half tongue-in-cheek point about everyone running away from the compliance folks, is that, but that's how it's been seen. It's, I have to do this, check the box. And it's in the attitude of, what is the minimum I need to do to just get back? So what you just said right now, and I think that's absolutely fascinating. And if I use a slightly different phrase, maybe a bit more flamboyant, you're weaponizing governance, you're weaponizing compliance, you're weaponizing the regulator by saying, no, not only I'm going to treat it as I have no choice but to do it, I'm going to use this as the differentiator. I'm going to use this as the value proposition.
Exactly. And in fact, David, what I've seen in the industry, right, and talking to the various banks across the region as well, in fact, if I may be quite bold as to say this, those with the right intention, the right motivation, i.e. I want to use it, I want to be able to get better insights in terms of controls that my organization has. I want to be able to glean better innovation, better products that serve my customers. In fact, they do the data governance, in fact, in a much more how would I say, intrusive manner, instead of just skimming the surface, and say, let's just do enough for what the regulators want to see.
Yeah.
Let's just produce some 60-page policy, for example. No, it doesn't. Whereas for those that are regulated, interestingly, they're required to comply with, for example, BCBS 239 in the banking industry. Then they'll always ask the question, Irene, so what is the minimum requirements? What can I get away with? And what costs me minimum money? So that's always the typical, okay, I want to do it in a minimum time, minimum cost, and of course, something that can minimally meet the bar of the regulators. So if you see these two sets of considerations, therefore you start to realize that those with the right motivation actually tend to fare a lot better.
It is really fascinating. They're going from one point to another and maybe experiencing a lot of kind of volatility. So you need to know what's happening. But you could argue that perhaps the degree of regulatory requirements in terms of data, of information, bill of materials, something that's been challenging for years, especially from the world of finance. So if someone's thinking about this, no matter whether senior or junior, it doesn't matter, or listening to us, what's that shift, that moment whereby someone goes, no, yeah, I see this as a valid purpose. I see this as a way of monetizing. Given that you've been through that entire spectrum, I'm genuinely curious. What is it?
Okay, maybe what I see, and this is only restricted to what I see, a lot of it is driven by the need to remain competitive, the need to survive, just purely to survive. For example, if you're even looking at during the pandemic itself, you're looking at those businesses that have survived. Actually, they have digitized a lot earlier than others. And to talk about digitization, how can you digitize without having the right data in mind and to be able to use the right data in place, right? And it is with this kind of realization, the organizations start to turn around and say, you know what, actually, there was a benefit involved. And you look at what my competitors are doing. So people are always looking around at their peers in terms of what my peers are looking. And is there a benefit for me to be able to look at what my peers are doing and to be able to do likewise as well? And in fact, can I do even better? So there's always this need to survive, need to be able to thrive even.
And perhaps if I add one more to what you're saying is using the information, being, because if you think about it, when organization, and again, to be fair, while COVID has been a horrendous period for many, has been ironically a renaissance for data in a certain degree. It's because suddenly organizations went, hey, we need to digitize this. We need to have a mechanism to remotely engage with customers or businesses or B&B, et cetera, and so on. And now suddenly the data is used. The information is used. So those inconsistencies, those, okay, I don't want to go as far as call it lapses, had a genuine impact and bearing. But I still find it fascinating because, again, one would argue that a traditional mindset would be, especially if the tough gets going, is, oh, where do I reduce my cost? We have to pour all this money into stuff that a lot of times we don't really understand why we need it. How can we cut it down? And in fact, that's interesting because a lot of times, like even when I used to speak, I still do, spoke more with folks on that side of the house, that's saying, why are you only using these investments? Why are you only using these requirements that are born on you just to meet the compliance? Why aren't you using that as the engine to do more? And in fact, to really push the boundaries, and I think I thought it once and they had this, the eyes opened up and looked at me as if I was crazy. And I said, compliance should be a revenue center.
In fact, it was very interesting. I was just discussing at lunch, actually, with a CEO of a bank over here in Singapore, right? And it was interesting because we're talking about compliance, the cost of compliance. I said, no, compliance doesn't have to be a cost. In fact, the reporting itself, you don't have to see that as a burden, because if you see that as a competitive advantage, and David, you will remember when we were creating this reporting tool in Union Digital Bank, we say when we are creating it just for reporting purposes, then, and also only for regulatory reporting purposes, number one, it defeats the whole purpose of having all the data available to you. So you want to be able to avail the data to you and across the various dimensions, and to allow you to have those insights as and when you want. Correct. And so this is where the mindset of the people who has the data has to shift. Now, again, there's also a reason for the shift in the mindset as well. And it's also, of course, with the prevalence of the number of data professionals as well in the industry. And people like you who go out and evangelize all of these benefits of data governance, right? It's true.
One has to preach.
Yes, and with many preachers around out there who tend to preach the benefits of it, people start to understand it a little bit more. And I'll be honest, right, data is a very fresh new topic. It's not like finance or compliance, which has been age old over there for the longest time. But data governance is a very fresh topic. And therefore, what can people do with data?
Is it a fresh topic?
It is freshly on the minds of people. If you think about it from a finance perspective, we have been living with data for the longest time, right? Even when we report to regulators, MA 610 in Singapore, for example, this has been all reporting about data. That's why I mentioned earlier on, right? Data is a means of communicating with the regulators about how my business is functioning. So if I may say that even in the recent years whereby people get to know more, especially from those non-regulated spaces, it's because they have been hearing and understanding more about what data is and how data governance is. And in fact, more and more universities are also catering for courses in data as well.
So, okay, as always, you bring phenomenal points. And I don't want to push the boundaries a bit.
Yeah.
It's not new, but it's new kind of scenario. Because it's always been there, whether we liked it or not. But now it's had this own kind of re-emergence on people's consciousness.
Yeah.
And when you think about largely the drive ultimately of economy, from a global economy, a regional, see, it's always the more than one, from a company perspective, even from a government's point of view and so forth. So when you think about the opportunities or the ambitions, I should say almost, the organizations and companies are trying to achieve, it's really about capitalizing on this ability to replicate and to multinationalize essentially. Now again, that is the goal, but then you have the building block of data. Now, in between, if you put that layer of governance. So it's an emerging space, and you have now multiple countries in which you're trying to operate. And to give a concrete example, so you've been on many panels, workshops, working committees. I could keep on going on the whole topic of cross-border data. And the must. It's something that's so critical. And again, and I actually like the way you described it of it's new, but in a way it's also not new. This aspect of cross-border data, same thing. It's new. We're all talking about it. We're all thinking actively about it.
Yeah.
But then it's not new. How do you do a phone call? How do you send mail? That's cross-border data, and it happens, and we're achieving it. And now, but suddenly it almost feels like there's this almost like burden of proof of difficulty of getting this interoperability.
Okay.
And then I'm just going to say this. The thing that I kind of wonder, how do we go about it when it feels like every conversation about cross-border data, specifically in the world which is driven by finance, becomes about payments?
Yeah. How many hours do you have for me?
No, go for it.
David, I'm going to be very provocative when we're talking about cross-border data sharing, right? You know, how we're working on this together. First of all, if I may so just say, maybe it was just about probably 15 years ago, just 1.5 decades ago, we haven't probably heard the term cross-border data sharing at all. In fact, sharing data wasn't such an issue at that point in time as well. Not much of an issue, I would say. Not to say that it's totally not an issue, but because of the fact that, first of all, people also didn't know much about data privacy at that point in time as well. And then came the fact that we need to do data privacy, and then after that, we then have all those restrictions in place. Then we start to talk about, oh, let's have cross-border data restrictions, right? Data sovereignty laws and so on and so forth. My personal take is honestly, why not go back to understanding why do we even need to have those data protection in place in the first instance? It's because
that is pretty provocative.
Yeah, because you want to prevent the abuse of the data, the misuse of the data itself. So therefore, instead of a whole laundry kind of a restriction in place, why can't we then just restrict on the purpose or the intentional use of data? In fact, allow the cross-border data sharing as a go-to, as an immediate ability for the country to share data, unless, and you put in unless, so unless you use it for financial crime, for fraudulent purposes or whatsoever, right? You can have a list. And so therefore, I find that this is...
So you mean by exclusion rather than inclusion?
Yeah, by exclusion. Yeah, exactly. Because currently countries operate by inclusion. Thou shalt not do this unless it is 1, 2, 3, you get my approval, and therefore you have a very restrictive purpose by a schedule itself. Now, I see no point in that actually.
Yeah, it's perplexing because how does business, literally, if you think about it right now, the conversation we're having is probably going through multiple countries.
Yes.
An email, so it's happening. Now, again, you brought up a point there, which it is important. Our knowledge capacity grows year on year. We understand better. And look, I never look back in time and judge the past with today's standards. I personally think that's the wrong thing. So same thing in terms of our understanding of data, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't give us the opportunity to improve. So things like data privacy, understanding on the potential criticality to individuals or entities, if any of that, important.
Yes.
On the same note is don't throw the baby with the bathwater type of situation. And this is what I'm wondering in terms of why is it so complex? And actually, if I take the theme of provocativeness, actually, does this have anything to do about data and or sharing? Is this maybe just about trust?
Perhaps. Well, in the first instance, and for data protection, especially with respect to individuals, with the prevalence of all the available information about individuals on the internet, right? So I'm all for protection. And therefore, I think that a form of restriction on the use of data is permissible. That said, I feel that if we are going to use data in a way that is quite globalized, and we should, because our businesses are growing global, our financial institutions are also growing global as well, then we are not seeing ourselves as one global entity, right? And if I were to say, for example, it's almost a few provinces within a country in itself saying, okay, I cannot share data with this province or that province, but we're remaining in the same country. If I use the same argument as a globe, we are all operating in different parts of the globe itself, and yet we're seeing the globe as one big nation together, and therefore, in terms of the collaboration itself, we should be using data to collaborate and to engender that trust. Now, when we talk about trusting, this is a bit of a political issue as well. Should we be trusting with our data? And therefore, whom can we be, how to say?
So I always said, and I still say, that data is in fact an intimate aspect.
Yeah.
And I know it's maybe a weird thing to say, but I truly believe in it, because think about it. Data, again, whatever, putting aside what you collect and all that, but what it represents, it's intimate in that it is a true, unadulterated view of something, of you as an individual, of the process. I always say that, look, no matter what you tell me, when you look at the data, I will see the truth, or at least the truth that's been captured.
Yeah.
So with that, I think it's important to have the acknowledgement of that sensitivity. Let's call it out. Although, by the way, sensitivity should never, ever be used in a form of governance. Sensitiveness is an emotional state. I just want to put it out there. Whenever I see these forums and it says, oh, this is sensitive, I'm like, how do you even begin to define it? Anyway, that's another rant for a different day.
Yeah.
But actually, I think it's important to have those difficult conversations about trust. And if you think about it, if I go back to your point about nation, global, provinces, well, we are doing it. We have doing. That's why we have diplomatic relations. That's why we have, at different levels, diplomatic relations. That's why some countries don't have diplomatic relations. And if you apply that same underlying principle and saying, look, we're friends, or we have, let's say, a certain degree of trade, but it's at that level, it literally inherits it in terms of data, meaning, to your point, permissible to within this bucket.
Correct.
Because it's tagged to our level degree of transparency, information sharing, police or intelligence sharing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, a country that you don't have, you're like, look, sorry, obviously, if I don't have a diplomatic relationship with you, I don't trust you. But because you see what I'm getting at, it feels like we're trying to reinvent that wheel in data.
Correct. And that's why it's very interesting when we talk about cross-border data sharing and all the restrictions that we have to manage, I would say manage, right? And it comes down to, as we'll talking, it comes down to 3 M's. The first of which is mindset of the politics in place, and the political leaders in place as well, and whether or not we have politically bilateral relationships in place. That's one. The second one is also very important, which is motivation. I find that, for example, if you're looking at improving cross-border trade, to be more efficient, you want to be able to combat financial crime, right? And you want to work collaboratively together. Now, that actually reduces quite a lot of efforts on both parties just to be able to collaborate together.
Absolutely.
So therefore, the motivation itself is also important as well. What is the benefits to both countries? And it must be to both countries. Finally.
I couldn't agree more. It's it's important. It's like I said, it's difficult conversations. I would argue, but it's as with anything, and a wise woman, my mother always used to say, is you don't boil the ocean to make a cup of tea, and that's how we approach it. But it is critical because data, whether one likes it or not, is the artery of and operations. And it actually reminds me when I'm much younger, less gray hairy consulting day. And, sometimes when talking about data and all that, I remember there'll be like business leaders who say, oh no, we don't need it. We don't need that. And I mean, put aside like whether you needed me with respect to the company that I was representing. I mean, that's a separate conversation. Really? You don't need data? How do you make a decision?
Yes, actually.
And again, I'm sometimes too overly simplistic, 1 + 1 kind of 2, looking at the periphery. But it's just a recognition that it's important. Concurrently to identifying where there's noise, and there's a lot of noise. In fact, I would argue that today we have far more noise than we would like to deal with. But that makes the due diligence, thinking about it in a very concrete and almost systematic approach.
Agree.
Important.
Yes, agree. Even, for example, this time you're talking about using data to make decisions, right? So I call it data-driven decision making. In fact, even by intuition, which is the other spectrum of it, even intuition is based on data points, right? Isn't it? That's
it is. It is.
Intuition as well. So just now I was going through the 3 M's, right? The last M is the methods. The method in which you share the data itself to engender that trust, right? So after having established that the motivation is in place, then how do you share the data without breaching on those, for example, individual privacy restrictions? That is also important. So what is the technology tool that you use? And then how do you ensure each other that, you're protecting the data in the same way? And how do you protect another person's data or another country's data that is given to you in the same way that as they would have done it themselves? And so that is what I call the method. And that is enforced by, of course, technology and tools.
And clicking on the method aspect, and that goes back to the point of the rate of progress is staggering. I still remember conversations I used to have with my grandmother, who was in an era whereby there were horse and carriage. There weren't even cars. So it is absolutely staggering. It's the reality of today. And again, we can argue on the efficacy, we can argue and the generalizability and whether it can be used for everything. Again, put that degree of, I almost call it philosophical debate aside. The reality is there are methods that in fact fundamentally change the way we think. Like even the term data sharing. I would argue that 99% of people, I may be wrong, and I'm happy to hear that I'm wrong. 99% of people, when you say the word even just sharing or data sharing, there is a visual representation of me literally handing over something to you.
Correct.
Whereas when we think about now, or we look at the digital world and we look at the technological capacity that's available, that's no longer the case. I'm able to provide an ability to leverage on without ever giving, without ever letting go. And now that becomes really important because then, back to the point we were discussing earlier about trust, that's interesting because suddenly that question of trust is, I won't say it's diminished, but it changes. Because previously the trust is, I'm giving you basically something. Now, I have to trust you in terms of how you're going to use it and what you're going to do with it downstream. But if I'm no longer giving it, there may be still trust in terms of what insight, what decision you've made, etc. But it's me. I'm controlling it. So I can almost like eternally have the control. So that's a very important thing. And we should be thinking about it.
Correct. So to me, in my mind, even data sharing itself, why do you want to share data in the first instance is important. So, for example, if you're thinking about it, if you think deeper into it, it's really right. You want to use the data. So you want to glean the insights of your data to make a decision, right? So for example, if I'm talking about, just now we're talking about AML, KYC, sharing of data across countries, right? So basically, all we want to know is that person politically exposed. Is that person a genuine customer in your bank? Now, all you need are the answers. Do you need data about those individuals? Probably.
Okay, that is a really strong and important message because we forget sometimes that everything is data.
Yeah.
Because exactly, it says know your customers, KYC, customer due diligence. Actually, I don't care about all that sensitive stuff and all those things. We have this room full of lawyers that are arguing till the middle of the night. You actually look at it and go like, well, why are we doing this? It's like, all I need to know is a yes or no.
Yes.
That's it. That's all I need.
Yeah, David, I have gone through painfully 50 plus emails just to talk about data sharing with another country for purposes of identifying whether or not a person is able to be onboarded.
It's okay. So if I could swing all the way back
Yes.
to the question of regulation and compliance.
Yeah.
And you said again something important of as a principle, okay? Because
Yeah.
one can argue about execution is you don't need someone to tell you to do the right thing. You maybe need someone to help set the best practices, to set the guidelines. You need someone to. We need teachers.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, especially when there's a goal, there's an objective, there should be some degree of kind of almost a self-fulfilling, like a perpetual mobile kind of thing.
Understand.
In a way, should the role of the regulators change?
Provocative indeed. I should actually ask you back that question. But to me, I feel that the regulators should play an enabler role instead of a policing role. That is, to me, much more effective and also much more helpful as well to the industry. And that's what we need in this industry, right? To be able to drive the collaboration across various regulators instead of a police.
So maybe perhaps to be kind to our regulatory friends across the world, I would say it's a sequencing aspect. But perhaps, and again, provocative, the primary role of a regulator, I will use the term educator.
Educator.
It's an educator. The primary role is educator and someone to help drive things forward. So, for example, the conversation we had about data sharing. It's if you think about it, you need someone to come in and saying, folks, we see the conversation, we hear you, but it's the right conversation in the wrong time. We're in a different time. We need to change the conversation because of different views, different perspective. So, again, that's a term that pops into my head as an educator, a developer. However, for some things, like say, if I come and I educate you, Irene, these are the best practices that you should follow. I'm educating you. If you don't follow them on certain things, then the stick comes out. So it's a sequencing event.
I have a different view because to be an educator, you need to be someone who is been there, done that. And regulators do have a role to play by being in the regulatory space. And therefore, I think the industry would know what to do. So I don't think they need to be educated in terms of knowing what to do, right? But I feel that the regulators should be placed in a position whereby they should help to enhance by helping to share best practices. Sharing means to say, look, let's bring bank A, bank B, bank C together to collaborate together. And that's why I call them the enhancers. I call them the enablers. And not just within the country, across different countries as well.
So I'm because you know we love doing this. I'm going to press on that button and challenge you on this one in terms of the educator. And I would love to see how you take us. So if they don't need to be the educator, or we don't need, okay, when it's the regulator, we don't need the educator.
Yeah.
And as you said, the industry is sufficiently well aware or is able to go through the process.
Yeah.
Why isn't the industry solving the problem of data sharing cross-border?
I think to be honest and to be fair to the industry, it's very hard to do a lone effort in itself. So you need someone to be coming together to pull the strings together. And this is where regulators do have the backing of the politicians behind them, the government behind them. And that carries a lot more weight than just one little bank trying to do it, or even a financial association, right? A banking association trying to do it alone as a standalone. So with that so-called political backing behind it, the government behind it, that gives a lot more weight to it.
So it's also a coordinator. It's a coordinator.
Correct.
And
Correct.
it's some degree setting the tone, which probably they'll hate because they always say that maybe there's a moral hazard here, but to some degree setting the tone in terms of risk appetite.
Yeah, you're right. The other one, of course, is money, financing. Right? All of these efforts will require finances, right? So it's a matter of we can harness industry together and to do it in a way whereby we can even pilot another country. It needs some investments. It definitely needs. And where do those investment money come from? I would believe that, again, as a role as an enhancer, educator, as you call it, to me, that would probably be best played by the regulators.
That is definitely provocative, especially if you look at the majority of the world. If a regulator says, I'm not going to fund you to do that stuff, that's your job. You should be driven by your own ambition to progress and all that. But that is absolutely fascinating. But I think at the end of the day, whatever it is, whatever the combination, whether it's a coordinator, motivator, in some degrees educator, etc., and so forth, I think to a certain degree, and again, not to be fair to the regulators, I think there's a call out of we just simply need to look at things differently. We need to open up the spectrum of possibilities. Just like we were discussing earlier, COVID created a force de majeure of you simply have to remember, not suddenly you could sign documents online.
Yeah.
And I remember this because just kind of through the whole process. And for me, signing documents is, I have had checks bounce the same check, by the way, multiple times because my signature didn't match the bank's. And whereby I would have to physically go to the bank and kind of like, I am here. And they're like, oh, but sorry, your signature's in my, but I'm physically here.
No, you're the big fake.
Yeah, well, was it physical fake? In person, I'm fake. But it took a pandemic, literally, it took a pandemic to suddenly go, oh, hold on a second, actually, we can do it differently.
Yes, correct. And this is what we see in the industry, right? When you're looking at even, for example, onboarding of customers, right? In the past, you've always got to go to a bank counter, a branch counter. And you've realized during the so-called pandemic itself, so many of the banks who hadn't started doing the practice of online onboarding of customers, then proceeded to do, for example, you use liveness checks and so on and so forth. And in fact, even new regulations came out as well across a few countries, as a matter of fact. Biometric identification, liveness checks, and so on and so forth. Now, however, I also want to say as well, that was during the pandemic. Times have also changed now as well with Gen AI and the deepfakes and whatever not. So, for example, I used to call one particular bank and they were able to use voice recognition. Now they've eradicated that. You know what they have done now? They said, okay, what is your mother's maiden name?
Yeah.
Good old days.
Oh, we're back to memory tests. That's also what a signature is, by the way. It's a memory test. Oh, that's fine. But I want to swing back and just leave this the back of my mind and the back of other folks, which is really interesting. At the end of the day, obviously, every organization, whether it's a regulated or non, or likely to know it's regulated, to take their ultimate approach, defining the risks, etc. It's this message of, and again, I can use the provocative term of weaponizing compliance to seeing compliance as not seeing compliance as a cost, as you said it. And I think that is a profoundly important perspective because even if compliance is a cost, having that motive view from the business in terms of, I have to do this anyway. How do I assure, and how do I make sure it is providing me the maximum value in doing business and providing even a value add? And I think in today's era, if we kind of segue to not just AI and Gen AI and all this kind of funky stuff that out there and wearable devices and all that, trust, privacy, it's difficult to earn, very quickly lost. And it's something that's extremely important. And having an ability in order to provide a certain degree of that openness and transparency and that trust mark is absolutely critical. So I absolutely love that point in terms of, and everything that comes underneath it, whether it's about thinking differently, approaching it. Compliance as a business enabler. I'm just going to summarize it as that. Compliance as a business enabler.
I love it. I should use this term to evangelize to my clients.
Go for it.
You don't know why? Because look, especially when the regulators are also looking for multiple ad hoc requirements, right, to manage the emerging risks, such as all the FX changes, right, FX risks, and even geopolitical risks as well. So banks are required to gather multiple data points to submit to regulators. On top of that, our infamous MS10, or not so infamous MS10, whereby we have to actually submit about close to 300,000 kinds of different data points to regulators. Why? Why are we not making better use of those data points for our own internal so-called insights and also analysis purposes, right? And I find that if we had known how to better harness those data points for internal so-called controls and also analysis, right, that itself would have helped us in our business a lot. Yeah.
Irene, surmised in a way that I could never. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the continued conversations in between coffees.
Thank you so much, David.